The Royal Air Force called it unsuitable for combat patrol. The British returned every one they were given. Inside the United States Navy itself, senior officers preferred a different aircraft. They called it a compromise. They called it the ugly sister of the patrol fleet. By the end of the Second World War, this aircraft would sink more enemy ships than any other American patrol bomber. It would kill 10 German submarines in the Atlantic. It would save more downed aviators in the Pacific than every other rescue type combined, and almost no one would remember its name. This is the story of the Martin PBM Mariner, the flawed flying boat that the United States Navy nearly cancelled before it ever fought. To understand how it came to exist at all, you have to go back to the autumn of 1936. The world was sliding towards something it could not name yet. The German Kriegsmarine was building submarines faster than anyone in Washington wanted to admit. The Imperial Japanese Navy was constructing what would become the largest combatant fleet in the Pacific Ocean. And the United States Navy looked at its primary patrol aircraft and saw something it could no longer pretend was enough. The consolidated PBY Catalina was a fine machine. It was reliable. It was simple to maintain. It was loved by the men who flew it, but it carried only 4,000 pounds of bombs. It cruised at 179 miles an hour. Its defensive guns were light, and its single deck could not accept the new radar sets and the new depth charges that anti-submarine warfare was beginning to demand. The Navy needed something bigger. Something faster, something heavier in the air and harder to kill, but it also had to keep one quality that no land-based bomber could offer. It had to land on water. Because there were still vast stretches of the world's oceans where there was no runway, no fuel depot, no defended perimeter. Only a sheltered patch of salt water and a ship anchored in the middle of it. In 1937, the Bureau of Aeronautics issued a contract. They sent it to the Glenn Martin Company of Middle River, Maryland. Glenn Martin himself was not a young man anymore. He had been building aircraft since 1909, when most Americans had never even seen one fly. He had been at this longer than most of the engineers in his factory had been alive. But he was still personally involved in the decisions that mattered, and he made one for this new aircraft that nobody had asked him to make. Before committing steel to a full-sized prototype, he ordered something strange. He ordered a flying scale model, 3/8 the size of the real thing, powered by a 120 horsepower Chevrolet automobile engine. They called it the Tadpole Clipper. It first flew on December 3, 1937. A man named Edward Fenimore was at the controls. He took it up over the Chesapeake and put it through everything the engineers wanted to see: climb, glide, water handling, stability in a turn. The little machine logged 13 hours of testing. And the data was so persuasive that the Navy did something almost unheard of in peacetime procurement. They ordered 20 production aircraft for $5.3 million. Before the real prototype had even been built, Glenn Martin had bet on the science, the Navy bet on Glenn Martin, and both of them were about to be tested. The full-size prototype was designated the XPBM-1, Bureau number 0796. It rolled out of the factory at Middle River early in 1939. On February 18th, it made its first flight. What happened in the air that day nearly ended the program. The horizontal stabilizer was flat, the twin vertical fins were perfectly upright, and the tail flapped in flight. It flapped with severe and dangerous flutter. The pilots could feel it through the controls. Directional stability was poor. The yaw axis was on the edge of being uncontrollable. One internal assessment, written in the careful language of engineers who do not want to put a man in a coffin, described the aircraft as marginally controllable. That phrase means nothing if you have never flown an airplane. It means everything if you have. The Navy nearly walked away. Glenn Martin's team went back to the wind tunnels. The fix they found was simple. It was also brutal in the way that aviation engineering sometimes has to be. They gave the horizontal stabilizer 10 degrees of upward dihedral. They left the vertical fins mounted at right angles to the new stabilizer, and the fins as a consequence tilted inward, that tilted twin tail, the one that became the Mariner's signature silhouette. The one that pilots described as elegant, the one that aviation historians would later study as a clever piece of design. It was none of those things. It was repair. It was a patch. It was a desperate response to an airframe that almost wasn't going to work. And for the next 25 years, the most distinctive feature of the Martin Mariner would be a permanent reminder of how close the United States Navy came to cancelling the entire program in February of 1939. The production aircraft, when it finally came, was different in every way that mattered. The standard mid-war combat variant was called the PBM-3D. It carried two Wright R2600 twin cyclone engines, 14 cylinders each, air-cooled, 1900 horsepower per side. Its wingspan was 118 feet. Its loaded weight was 58,000 pounds. It cruised low and steady at 135 miles an hour, and it pushed 211 at full power. It carried 4,000 pounds of bombs on a routine patrol. 8,000 if the mission was worth the risk. 850 caliber Browning machine guns lived in 5 powered turrets, and the men who manned them knew that on a long patrol those guns were the only thing standing between them and a German fighter that had spotted them first. The first squadron, designated VP-55, was commissioned on the 1st of August 1940. The location was Norfolk, Virginia. The commanding officer was a lieutenant commander named A.B. Vosseler. He had grown up in an America that did not yet know it was about to be at war, and he was given an aircraft that was supposed to fight German submarines in the open Atlantic. The first Mariner arrived a month later. By May of 1941, the squadron had been redesignated VP-74. They were operating out of Argentia, Newfoundland. They were flying convoy-esque over the North Atlantic. The German submarines were already out there. The shooting had already started. America just had not officially admitted it yet. In July of that year, 2 of the Argentia aircraft were fitted with British ASV radar, air-to-surface vessel radar, a British invention given to American crews because the British had built it first and the Americans had not yet built anything as good. Those 2 aircraft became the first operational radar-equipped aircraft in the entire United States Navy. The Mariner was already doing things no one had asked it to do, but it still had critics. And they were not all on the German side. In October of 1943, the Royal Air Force received 32 Mariners. They were designated Mariner GR1. They were assigned to No. 524 Squadron at Oban in Scotland. The squadron's job was to evaluate the aircraft for British coastal patrol work. For 2 months, they tested it. They flew it, they wrote reports. In December of 1943, No. 524 Squadron was disbanded. Not a single operational sortie was flown. The British returned every aircraft to the Americans. They placed new orders for more Sunderland flying boats, which they preferred. And the verdict from the Royal Air Force, the most experienced maritime patrol force in the world, was clear. The Martin Mariner was not, in their opinion, suitable for combat patrol. That assessment would prove to be one of the great misjudgments of the war. Because by the time the Royal Air Force was writing the Mariner off in Scotland, the Mariner had already killed its first German submarine. It had already drowned a Knight's Cross holder in the Western Atlantic, and it had already begun what would become the most concentrated anti-submarine campaign by a single aircraft type in the entire Western Hemisphere. To understand how that happened, you have to go back to the morning of June 30th, 1942, 450 nautical miles west of Bermuda, a flat blue Atlantic, a high cloud base, and inside the cockpit of a Martin Mariner from Squadron VP-74, a Navy lieutenant named Richard E. Schrader sat at the controls. He was not a famous pilot. He was not a celebrated ace. He was a man at work doing what the Navy paid him to do. Patrol, search, listen, wait. The crackle came in over his headset shortly after 11:30 in the morning. A high-frequency direction-finding station, somewhere on the coast, had fixed a German submarine. A long radio transmission. A status report to Berlin. The bearing was solid. The submarine was U-158, a Type 9C boat, Lieutenant Commander Erwin Rostin in command, Knight's Cross holder, veteran of multiple patrols. He had sunk 12 Allied ships on this final patrol, and 17 across his entire command of U-158. 17. That number is worth saying out loud. 17 ships. Cargo holds full of fuel, ammunition, food, machine parts, the small everyday things that an industrial nation at war needs to keep moving. 17 captains who had to write final entries in their logbooks. 17 radio operators tapping out the position of a sinking ship to anyone who might still be listening. Rostin was on his way home. He had 2 American prisoners on board. They were the captain and the second officer of the SS Stanvac Palembang, an American tanker his crew had sunk earlier in the patrol. He was charging his batteries on the surface in broad daylight 450 miles from the nearest enemy airfield. He had no reason to believe he was in any danger he could not see. Schrader saw him first. He came down out of the cloud base. He pushed the nose over. He lined up his depth charge run, and he salvoed. One of the depth charges, by chance or by skill, struck the conning tower of the submarine and lodged there. U-158 began to dive. The depth charge went down with her. It detonated underwater. There were no survivors. 54 Germans died in the next 10 seconds. So did the 2 American merchant sailors that Rostin had been carrying home as prisoners. They went down inside a steel tube with a Knight's Cross holder and a successful patrol and a submarine that only a moment before had been one of the most dangerous predators in the Western Atlantic. The aircraft that killed them was the Martin PBM Mariner, the aircraft the Royal Air Force had not yet refused, the aircraft American senior officers had quietly described as a compromise. The aircraft whose tilted tail was a repair job and whose first prototype had nearly been cancelled. In 10 seconds it had ended Erwin Rostin's career, and it was just getting started. What killed Erwin Rostin was not just an aircraft, it was a system. By the summer of 1942, the United States Navy and the Royal Canadian Navy and the British Coastal Command had stitched together something that no one had ever built before. A network, listening stations on 3 continents, high-frequency direction-finding receivers tuned to the exact wavelengths a German submarine used when it talked to Berlin. Every time a U-boat captain pressed his transmit key, even for 30 seconds, a triangulation was forming around him. The U-boat skippers knew this. They knew the longer they transmitted, the more dangerous it became, but they had to talk. Berlin demanded it. Status reports, weather observations, sinkings, fuel state, Wolfpack coordinates. Every voice on the radio was a knife pointing at the man holding the microphone. The Mariner was the knife that travelled. A Mariner could carry the ASV radar that the British had built. A Mariner could carry depth charges. A Mariner could fly 12 to 14 hours on a single mission and search a square of ocean 1,000 miles across. And the Mariner did not need an airfield to come home to. It needed a tender. A seaplane tender was a converted auxiliary anchored in any sheltered patch of water with a fuel hose, a workshop, a crane, and a few good cooks. You could move a tender overnight. You could anchor it at Argentia or Reykjavik. You could send it down to Trinidad or Aratu Bay or Recife. You could put the war wherever the war needed to be. And in the spring of 1943, the war needed to be in the South Atlantic. The Germans had figured out that the convoys running between Brazil and the United States were lightly protected. Knight's Cross holders began appearing in the waters off Bahia and Rio. Boats with names like U-128 and U-530 and U-161. Commanders with reputations and tonnage and medals. They came down the coast in numbers that the United States Navy had not expected, and they began to sink ships at a rate that the United States Navy could not tolerate. So the Mariners came south. On the 17th of May 1943, 2 PBMs from Squadron VP-74 went out from a base in northeast Brazil. They were flown by Lieutenant Howland Davis and Lieutenant Carey. The names matter. These were not famous men. They are not in the textbooks, but they did the work. They fixed U-128 on the surface off the coast of Bahia. They drove her under. They damaged her enough that she could not stay submerged. And then, in the way these kills often happened, the destroyers came in and finished her with 5-inch gunfire. The captain, a young German named Hermann Steinert, was pulled from the water along with 46 of his crew. 7 men were dead. Steinert was 30 years old. He had spent the war learning his trade. He would spend the rest of it in an American prisoner of war camp. That was the deal the Atlantic was offering in the summer of 1943. Live in a camp in Texas or die in a steel tube in the dark. A lot of men did not choose, but that was the outcome. On the 15th of July, VP-32 sank U-159 in the Caribbean. There is not much to say about that one in the records. A radar contact, an attack, a submarine that did not come up again. All 53 men aboard her died. Most of them had been at sea for the better part of a month. 4 days later, on the 19th of July, off Santa Catarina, a young lieutenant junior grade named Roy Whitcomb of VP-74 took off in a Mariner that his crew had nicknamed the Nickel Boat. Nobody alive today remembers exactly why. The name was painted on the nose in the way that crews painted things on the nose to remind themselves that the airplane was theirs, that they had touched it, that they were not just passengers in a flying machine that the Navy owned. Whitcomb found U-513. The German commander was Friedrich Guggenberger. He was 28 years old. He held the Knight's Cross. He had earned it in the Mediterranean, where he had torpedoed and sunk the British aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal in November of 1941. He was, by any honest measure, one of the most successful submarine officers the Kriegsmarine ever produced. Whitcomb's Mariner came in low. The depth charges went into the water. U-513 broke apart and went down. 46 men died inside her. Guggenberger and 6 others surfaced in the wreckage and were picked up. The Knight's Cross holder went into an American prisoner of war camp in Arizona, where he would survive the war, return to West Germany, and eventually retire as a rear admiral in the new German Navy. The Mariner had not just sunk a submarine, it had captured a future flag officer of a country that did not yet exist. A week later, on the 26th of July, a Mariner from VP-32 destroyed U-759 east of Jamaica. 2 days after that, on the 28th, another Mariner of VP-32 killed U-59 in the Mona Passage between Hispaniola and Puerto Rico. 47 men were aboard U-359 when the Mariner found her. 47 men were dead an hour later. There were no survivors. There was nothing to interrogate, nothing to pull from the water, nothing to send back to Norfolk in a sealed report. Just an oil slick and silence and a German submarine that would never reach Lorient again. That is the rhythm of anti-submarine warfare in the summer of 1943. A boat goes out. A boat goes down. The men who killed it have lunch on the tender. The men who died in it do not. Then came U-199. On the 31st of July, off Rio de Janeiro, a lieutenant named William Smith of VP-74 took his Mariner out on patrol. The target he found was a Type 9D submarine on the surface. The German captain, Hans-Werner Krauss, had a choice. He could dive and try to outlast the attack, or he could stand and fight. He had 4 heavy anti-aircraft guns on the deck of his boat. He had a trained crew. He had pride. He chose to fight. Smith made his first attack run from the side. He came in low through a wall of 20mm fire that was thick enough to see in the air, that you could almost lean on as you flew through it. The engine nacelle of his Mariner took 3 direct hits. He kept coming. The depth charges went into the water. They damaged the submarine. They did not kill her. Smith pulled up and around, and he made a second pass. This one was nearly bow on. It is the most difficult attack to deliver. The German gunners had a stationary target coming straight at them. Smith had to hold the aircraft level inside a cone of fire from his own 12 o'clock position. He held it. The depth charges did not finish U-199, but they crippled her so badly that she could not submerge. She had to stay on the surface and continue the fight. A Brazilian Air Force Catalina arrived a little later and delivered the killing blow. 49 Germans died in the water, 12 were captured. Among them was the captain, who had ordered his men to stay topside and shoot it out with the American. He was interrogated 3 days later. The transcript of that interrogation went into the action report of VP-74. The German captain said this. He said he had lost most of his men by gunfire from the Mariner. He said the removal of the bow turret from this type of aircraft would be sorely missed. He was, in his way, paying a professional compliment to the men who had killed his crew. That is the verdict that mattered, not the Royal Air Force in a quiet office at Oban deciding the Mariner was unsuitable for combat patrol. Not the senior American officers who preferred the 4-engine Liberator. The verdict that mattered was the one from a German submarine captain, sitting in a Brazilian holding cell, watching the war end for him in slow motion, telling his American interrogators that the aircraft they had just used to kill his men was the most dangerous thing he had ever seen come out of a cloud. That was on the 31st of July. 3 days later, the Mariner began to find out what it cost to kill a U-boat that fought back. On the night of the 3rd of August, off Trinidad, a lieutenant junior grade named Clifford Cox of VP-205 made a radar attack on U-572. He found her in the dark. He came down low. He pressed the attack home. The submarine's anti-aircraft gunners saw him. They fired. They hit. Cox's Mariner went into the Caribbean. U-572 went down too. The damage was that severe. But she did not surface again, and Cox's aircraft did not surface again, and when the search aircraft arrived in daylight, there was nothing left to find but oil and silence. 12 Americans died in that Mariner, 47 Germans died in that submarine. There were no survivors. From either side, it was the first Martin Mariner ever lost in combat to an enemy submarine. It was killed by the boat it had just killed. And the two crews, who had spent the last few minutes of their lives trying to murder each other in the dark, went to the bottom of the same patch of ocean within minutes of each other. A young lieutenant, an entire American crew, an entire German crew, all of them under the same water, in the same darkness by the morning of the 4th of August 1943. There is no medal for what happened that night. There is no monument. There is only a navigational fix in a logbook in Washington and a different fix in a logbook in Berlin, and the certainty that 12 American mothers and 47 German mothers had not yet been told. 3 days later, the Mariner went after the boat that the German records would describe as the largest aircraft hunt ever mounted for a single submarine, U-615. The boat was caught in the Caribbean, off the island of Aruba. Her commander was Ralph Kapitsky. He was 27 years old. His crew was tired. His boat was damaged. And the United States Navy was about to throw everything it had at him. 5 mariners, from VP-204 and VP-205, supported by a PV-1 Ventura of Squadron VB-130, over 2 days. 5 aircraft, 1 submarine, 2 days. The math should have been simple. It was not. A Mariner commanded by Lieutenant Anthony Matuski pressed an attack run on U-6 Mufdeen. The submarine's anti-aircraft fire caught his aircraft and brought it down. Bureau number 673 went into the Caribbean. All 12 men aboard were killed. There were no survivors. 12 more American lives, gone in seconds fighting a submarine that was already half dead. The hunt continued. A lieutenant junior grade named John Dressbach delivered the final attack. His depth charges damaged U-615 beyond saving. She did not come back up. 43 of Kapitsky's men were rescued by an American destroyer. 4 were dead in the water before the destroyer arrived. Kapitsky himself was pulled from the sea alive, but he was bleeding badly from wounds taken during the attacks, and he died not long after. He was 27 years old. To kill 1 U-boat, the United States Navy had traded 12 American airmen, 1 Mariner, and 48 hours of combat operations that put every aircraft in the hunt within reach of the same anti-aircraft guns that had killed Matuski. That was the price. That was always the price. The Mariner did not kill submarines from a safe altitude. It did not kill them with guided missiles from 20,000 feet. It killed them by flying down to mast height in daylight or in radar darkness into the muzzle flash of every gun the U-boat had, and dropping ordnance close enough to crack the pressure hull. You had to be that close to do the work, and the Germans, when they chose to fight, could shoot back. The last Atlantic kill came on the 27th of September 1943. A lieutenant junior grade named Harry Patterson of VP-74 sank U-161 off the coast of Brazil. The German commander was Albrecht Achilles. He held the Knight's Cross. He was 29 years old. Achilles and all 53 of his men were lost. When the United States Navy counted up its anti-submarine warfare results, the numbers told a story that the Royal Air Force in Scotland had not predicted. Of 29 German submarines killed by Navy patrol aircraft in the Atlantic during the war, 10 had been killed or shared by Martin Mariners, 10 out of 29, 34%. A single aircraft type, the one that critics had called unsuitable for combat patrol, had accounted for more than a third of every U-boat the United States Navy Patrol Aviation Arm had managed to destroy. The Mariner had also lost crews. It had lost Cox and his 12 men. It had lost Matuski and his 12 men. It had lost aircraft in accidents, in storms, in landings on water that was rougher than the manuals said it should have been. The men who flew it knew by the autumn of 1943 that this was not an easy way to make a living. It was a long, slow, methodical way to die if anything went wrong over an empty ocean, but it worked. And by the time the German submarines had largely been driven out of the Western Atlantic, the United States Navy was already moving the Mariner to a different ocean, a different war, a different enemy. On the 1st of October 1944, a lieutenant named Floyd Wardlow of Squadron VPB-16 took off from Saipan. Saipan was a captured island in the Mariana Group. The Japanese had held it through some of the most brutal fighting of the war. The Marines had taken it in June. By the autumn, the seaplane base on Tanapag Harbor was open for business, and the mariners were flying long patrols across the Western Pacific. What Wardlow found that morning was a Japanese submarine on the surface, I-177, a boat that had been operating in support of Imperial Japanese Navy operations throughout the South Pacific. Wardlow attacked with a new weapon, the Mark 24 acoustic homing torpedo, codenamed Fido. It was an air-dropped weapon that listened for the sound of a submarine's propellers and steered itself toward them. It was in 1944 one of the most secret weapons in the American arsenal. The Fido went into the water beside I-117. It found her. It crippled her. Wardlow stayed on the contact and vectored in the hunter-killer group built around the escort carrier USS Hoggett Bay. 2 days later, on the 3rd of October, the destroyer escort USS Samuel S. Miles finished I-177 with Hedgehog projectors. 101 Japanese sailors were aboard her. All of them died. The Mariner had just killed in the Pacific. The Atlantic was largely over. The U-boats had been driven back. The convoys were getting through. The big oceans of the war were beginning to shift. But the Pacific was a different kind of ocean. It was bigger, the distances were longer. The enemy fleet was scattered across 10,000 miles of water and islands. There were almost no airfields out there. And whatever was going to happen next was going to require an aircraft that could fly 12 hours from a tender in a place that had not existed on any map 2 weeks earlier. The Atlantic was done. The Mariner was just beginning. By the spring of 1945, the war had moved. The U-boat threat in the Western Atlantic was gone. The seaplane tenders that had anchored off Trinidad and Brazil were on their way west. The crews who had killed Rostin and Krauss and Achilles were rotating through new training. Some of them were not coming back. Some of them had been buried at sea, or in cemeteries on Bermuda, or in family plots in towns nobody outside of America had ever heard of. But the men who were coming were going somewhere worse. They were going to Okinawa. The largest amphibious operation of the Pacific War was scheduled to begin on the 1st of April 1945. Hundreds of thousands of American servicemen, a fleet of more than 1,000 ships, and the Japanese Empire fighting on its own doorstep for the first time in the war with kamikazes and shore batteries, and an army that had been told to die rather than surrender. The man in charge of putting the soldiers and Marines on the beach was Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner. He was nearly 60 years old. He had been a Navy officer since 1908. He had done this kind of work at Guadalcanal and Tarawa and Saipan, and he understood something about amphibious assault that had taken the Navy years to learn. You do not start the invasion on the beach you want. You start it on a small island next to the beach you want, 6 days early where the enemy is not expecting you. You take that small island, and then, while the main fleet is still rolling toward the real target, you turn the small island into a forward base. The small island Turner chose was Karama Reto, a group of rocks and harbors 15 miles west of Okinawa. The American forces went ashore there on the 26th of March 1945. They took it in 3 days, and inside the sheltered anchorage at Aka, in waters that the Japanese Empire had controlled the week before, the United States Navy established a forward seaplane base. 15 tenders dropped anchor: USS Norton Sound, Pine Island, Hamlin, St. George, Yakutat, Bering Strait, Kenneth Whiting, Gardiner's Bay, Chandler, Curtis, and several more. They came in slow, with their cranes and their workshops and their fuel hoses, and they tied up to buoys in a harbour that had been Japanese sovereign territory 4 days earlier. At peak operations, 6 squadrons of Martinmariners were flying out of that anchorage: VPB-13, VPB-18, VPB-26, VPB-27, VPB-208. They were flying patrols of 600 to 1,000 miles. across the East China Sea, the Tsushima Strait, the west coast of Korea, the Yellow Sea, southern Kyushu. They were the eyes and they were the killers of the most ambitious flying boat operation in the history of warfare. What followed was carnage for Japanese coastal shipping. VPB-18 alone, in just 3 months, sank 44 ships and shot down 10 Japanese aircraft. 44 ships. That number is worth pausing on. In 3 months, from one squadron, operating from a harbour that had not existed on any American map 90 days earlier. On the 5th of May 1945, 2 mariners of that squadron sank 4 ships totaling 7,500 gross tons off the Korean coast in a single mission. The Japanese merchant marine, which had been the iron pipeline supplying the Imperial Army on the mainland, was being strangled one tanker at a time, one freighter at a time, one coastal trawler at a time, by aircraft that had been called unsuitable for combat patrol. On the 15th of May, a formation led by Lieutenant Marvin Hart of VPB-18 was intercepted by 3 Japanese fighters from the elite 343rd Naval Air Group. The 343rd was the personal command of Captain Minoru Genda, the same officer who had helped plan the airstrike on Pearl Harbor. The fighters were N-1K Shidenkai. The Allied code name was George. They were among the finest piston engine fighters Japan ever built, and they were flown by some of the last well-trained pilots the Imperial Japanese Navy still had. Hart's gunners were credited with shooting down all 3 of them, a flying boat, 211 miles an hour at full power. Built around an airframe that had nearly failed its first flight test, crewed by men who had been farming or selling insurance 2 years earlier, the N-1K Shidenkai, 4 20mm cannons in the wings. Maximum speed near 370 miles per hour, one of the few late-war Japanese fighters that could still climb with a Hellcat. Flown by men whose air group had been handpicked to defend the home islands. The mariners won that fight. VPB-18 paid for those results. The squadron lost 6 aircraft in 3 months. 3 to enemy action, 3 to accidents, aircraft and crews that did not come home, letters to families in Iowa and Kentucky and California, telegrams that arrived in the morning and ruined entire decades. That was the cost of 44 ships, but there is a statistic from Okinawa that should be on every memorial to this aircraft, and is not on any. The Bureau of Aeronautics report on air-sea rescue at Okinawa, written in 1959, examined the period from April to August 1945. Of 186 downed Allied airmen identified as potentially recoverable, 132 were saved. 63 of those rescues were made by Dumbo mariners flying dedicated rescue missions. 18 more were made by patrol mariners diverting from anti-shipping work to pick up men in the water. The mariners saved 81 men. 44 were saved by surface ships, 5 by float planes. The mariners saved twice as many downed airmen as every other rescue type combined. These were not abstract numbers. These were boys from Cleveland and Birmingham and Tucson who had been shot down over the East China Sea, who were floating in salt water with broken bones and torn flight suits, who had given up hope and were watching the horizon and thinking about their mothers when a twin-engined flying boat broke through the haze and landed in chop that the manuals said was too rough to land in. The men who went home from the Pacific because of those rescues had children. Some of those children are still alive. Some of their grandchildren are watching this right now. By July of 1945, 13 Mariner squadrons were operating west of the Marianas, and this brings us, finally, to the question that has been waiting at the back of this entire story. How did the Martin Mariner stack up against the aircraft that was supposed to make it obsolete, the consolidated PB-4Y Liberator, and its dedicated naval successor, the PB-4Y2 Privateer? The comparison is honest. The Liberator was faster. It cruised at higher altitudes. Its turbocharged Pratt & Whitney engines pushed it to a maximum speed near 290 miles per hour. The Privateer carried 1250 caliber machine guns in 6 powered turrets. It was the most heavily armed patrol aircraft in the United States Navy, and one variant carried the Bat. The ASM-N2, the first guided air-to-surface missile ever used in combat by American forces. On paper, the Liberator and the Privateer won. None of that mattered. The Liberator needed an airfield. An airfield needed a runway, a fuel depot, hangars, a defended perimeter, and weeks of construction. Constructing such an airfield on a captured Pacific atoll took weeks of bulldozers and Seabees and marine perimeter patrols. By the time you could land a Liberator on a new Pacific island, the war had already moved 1,000 miles past it. The Mariner could fly from any sheltered patch of water from the day a tender dropped anchor. In the Atlantic, that meant Argentia and Reykjavik and Bermuda and Trinidad and Aratu Bay and Recife. In the Pacific, it meant Sapananoulithi and Iwo Jima and Karama-Reto. The Liberator could only follow the airfield builders. The Mariner went where the tender went. And the tender could be anywhere. The result is in the kill totals. 10 U-boats in the Atlantic, 44 Japanese ships in 3 months from one squadron, 81 pilots rescued. The privateer's Bat missile, for all its technical sophistication, sank only a handful of ships in the closing weeks of the war. The Mariner had been sinking ships for 3 years. 1,366 Martin Mariners were built between 1940 and 1949. They were all built at a single factory in Middle River, Maryland, where Glenn Martin had bet his company on a flying scale model with a Chevrolet engine. The Coast Guard retired its last PBM-5G from San Diego in 1958. The United States Navy retired the type in 1956 when V-50 transitioned to the Martin P-5M Marlin, which was a direct development of the Mariner airframe. The Marlin served until 1967. The Argentine Navy flew Mariners until May of 1962. The Uruguayan Navy flew the final example anywhere in the world, retiring her on the 3rd of February 1964. From first flight to last flight, 25 years. Today, exactly one intact Mariner survives, PBM-5A, Bureau number 122271. She is on display at the Pima Air and Space Museum in Tucson, Arizona. She wears the markings of a post-war transport squadron. She has 1,326 flight hours on her airframe. She is the only one. There are no others. The wrecks lie under Lake Washington, on Thurston Island in Antarctica, at the bottom of the Caribbean, at the bottom of the East China Sea. Captain Eric Brown was the British test pilot who flew 487 distinct aircraft types and assessed nearly every significant naval aircraft of the war. He flew the Messerschmitt and the Zero. He flew the Sea Fury and the Corsair. He flew aircraft that nobody else dared to fly. He never flew the Martin Mariner. The aircraft was simply too far outside the Royal Navy's carrier-focused requirements, so the historical record lacks the one assessment that would normally settle the question of an aircraft's quality. The Mariner was famous in its own service, and almost unknown to everyone else. It is the aircraft that the United States Navy used to kill 10 German submarines. The aircraft that drowned Erwin Rosten off Bermuda, Albert Achilles off Brazil, and the entire crew of U-359 in the Mona Passage. The aircraft that flew Smith through 20mm fire over Rio. The aircraft that took Cox into the dark and never brought him back. The aircraft that took Matuski and his 12 men into the Caribbean and left them there. The aircraft that turned Karama-Reto into the most ambitious flying boat operation in history. The aircraft that sank 44 Japanese ships from one squadron in 3 months. The aircraft that saved 81 American boys out of the water and flew them home to families they thought they would never see again. Not the fastest, not the most famous. Not the most beautiful airplane the Second World War ever produced, but the one that flew where the war actually was, and killed what was actually there. The records prove it. The documents confirm it. The ocean remembers, even if the rest of us forgot.